Hi, this is Rick Emmett, and Brent said I could say anything I want, so this is what I'm going to say. You're listening to Brent Jensen on No Sleep Till Sudbury, which apparently you can hear on Spotify or wherever you hear excellent podcasts. And this is Rick Emmett signing off.
Hey, this is Brent Jensen. You're listening to No Sleep Till Sudbury, the show where we talk about the music that makes your skin vibrate. The show is brought to you by Pariah Pickups. What you want, what you need, what you love. Check them out at pariahpickups.com. And should you be looking for a realtor, look no further than my pal, Mr. Steve Fleming. He's my personal realtor. I would never, ever use anyone else. And now that the market is definitely heating up again, you might want to give him a call. You can find him at FlemingProperties.com. All right, so today on No Sleep Till Sudbury, we ask the eternal question: what was the Beatles' best album? Within a time frame of 7 years, from 1963 to 1970, the Beatles recorded an extraordinary amount of material. The actual number of full-length album releases is popularly regarded as 13, beginning with Please Please Me in March 1963 and concluding with Let It Be in 1970. If you included all the songs that were released only as singles and did not technically appear on albums until CDs were introduced, the band's formal album catalog is considered to be 14 records. Much of this material is markedly prolific. The releases demonstrate the evolution of the Beatles from their origins as a skiffle group into pop Beatlemania madness, and then seeking a greater musical sophistication, embarking on a psychedelic musical journey, and then concluding with albums that are considered to be some of the best in recorded history, all in just 7 years. But which one of those albums is best? All right, the first 3 records, Please Please Me, With the Beatles, and A Hard Day's Night, are considered by pretty much everybody to be prime Beatlemania period records. It wasn't really until 1965 that we saw another side of the band, when the aptly named Beatles for Sale record came out. By that time, the band were exhausted by Beatlemania, and the album didn't really have that upbeat pop idol sheen that the first 3 records had. Their next record, Help, had more serious compositions on it, like Yesterday and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. This is a song that was suspected by some to be about Beatles manager Brian Epstein, who was homosexual and kept it a secret because of British laws at the time. And then came Rubber Soul. This record contained the band's first forays into psychedelia, and while the band were technically singing about love, it was a more sophisticated, deeper, and more jarring examination of love. The band was evolving very quickly at this point. It was around this time that the Beatles began to make their most sophisticated records, actual albums comprised of quality songs throughout, a departure from the previous strategy of just releasing records that contained 1 or 2 strong singles, rounded out with filler for the rest of the album. The Beatles' 9th release from 1968, technically called The Beatles, but more commonly known as the White Album, is a polarizing record. For me, it contains some truly brilliant musical moments, and it offers a true blood and guts representation of what the band was really about. It's definitely one of my favorite Beatles records, and widely considered to be great, but not quite up there with the best. That only leaves a couple of others, and from that group, 3 albums are commonly suggested to be the band's best. 1965's Revolver, 67's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Abbey Road from 1969. So let's start with Revolver. It's the 7th studio album by the band, a record they initially wanted to call Abracadabra. The album was recorded right around the time the Beatles decided they would no longer perform live, and because they now had more time, the group took full advantage of the studio technology of the day, progressing on the advances of Rubber Soul. Revolver is regarded as the official beginning of the group's psychedelic period. The material and instrumentation reflects a distinct interest in LSD, Eastern philosophies, and weightier themes like existentialism and death. Much use was made of effects like multi-tracking and vari-speed, tape looping, tape reversal, and as a result, the Beatles took more than 220 hours to record Revolver, not including the mixing of the record. Comparatively, Rubber Soul took less than 80. During the recording of Revolver, John Lennon and George Harrison's use of LSD definitely informed the album. Ringo Starr was recruited into the LSD gang, but Paul McCartney was a holdout. He refused to try the drug. He was much more focused on London's avant-garde community and Britain's emerging counterculture movement. Revolver kicks off with Taxman, Harrison's lament against the high taxes paid by bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and the song is considered a precursor to the 1970s punk rock movement. Oddly, McCartney played the guitar solo on Taxman, and tensions were beginning to form within the band. Lennon would say in a 1980 interview that he helped Harrison complete the song's lyrics by contributing a few lines. Quote, "To help the song along, because that's what George asked for. He came to me because he couldn't go to Paul, because Paul wouldn't have helped him during that period." For Eleanor Rigby, a string octet was arranged by producer George Martin, and while McCartney provides the song's lead vocal, no Beatle actually played on Eleanor Rigby. Scottish singer Donovan remembers McCartney playing an early version of Rigby on guitar when the song's character was named Ola Natugni. Another character from the song Father Mackenzie was originally named Father McCartney, changed to Mackenzie after a look through the phone book. And Rigby was the name of a store McCartney noticed on a walk around the time the song was written. Here, There, and Everywhere is an incredible ballad McCartney wrote towards the end of the Revolver sessions. Apparently, his inspiration for the song was the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds track, God Only Knows. And in turn, Beach Boy Brian Wilson had been inspired to write God Only Knows after hearing Rubber Soul, on repeat, apparently. Yellow Submarine was written by Lennon and McCartney as a children's song, and they gave it to Ringo so that he could sing a song on Revolver. Donovan helped out with the lyrics, and he would later say that Yellow Submarine metaphorically represented the Beatles' predicament as prisoners of their own fame. The song She Said contains a very interesting lyric, and that lyric is, I know what it's like to be dead. Lennon was inspired to use it based on a conversation that he and Harrison had had with Peter Fonda in Los Angeles while all three were on LSD. Fonda told them he knew what it was like to be dead because as a child, he had technically died during an operation. Another track Lennon wrote for Revolver called And Your Bird Can Sing was referred to by Lennon as a throwaway song. He said it was fancy paper around an empty box. The song was apparently about Frank Sinatra, inspired by an Esquire magazine article that Lennon had read in which Sinatra was referred to as the man who can have anything he wants. People also suggested the song is about Mick Jagger, the bird in question being Jagger's then girlfriend, Marianne Faithfull. All right, now moving on to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This record is widely recognized as an early concept album that broadened the roles of imagery, production, artwork, and popular music composition. The record had a massive cultural impact relating to fashion, drugs, sex, and mysticism, and it was considered to more or less represent contemporary youth and the counterculture of the time. Today it's still considered one of the most important recordings ever. And there's no denying that it's a truly amazing record. It's been said that with Sgt. Pepper's, McCartney wanted to create an alter ego for the band so they could be released of their Beatles obligations and experiment almost completely as another entity. Interestingly, two of the album's greatest songs, at least in my opinion, were left off the record: Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, released as a double A-side at the request of record company EMI. Back then, songs that were offered as singles didn't often appear on the subsequent record, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. I guess the Beatles were thought to be so prolific in their output that it didn't really matter, which is even crazier to think about when you consider the sheer quality of these songs. Now, around this time, the fissures in the Beatles foundation developed into proper cracks. Sgt. Pepper's was considered to be the last Beatles record that was genuinely a collective band effort. The stylistic divides between Lennon and McCartney were always there, but now those forces seem to oppose each other. A song like Getting Better is a perfect example of the difference in the worldviews of the two musicians. McCartney can be heard singing, "It's getting better," while Lennon provides that backing line, "It can't get no worse." For me, the entire theme of the record seems conflicted. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band begins with this rock show bluster that could be mistaken for mockery when you consider the fact that the Beatles had just given up touring because they so strongly disliked the idea of it. Around that time, Lennon said that they could have just wheeled out wax figures of themselves onto the stage instead of actually performing. Some of the more interesting moments on the Pepper's record include Lovely Rita, a unique song from McCartney, because he typically sang about more romantic love. And when you listen to the lyrics of Rita, it's anything but. The Lennon track Good Morning was about his cynicism as it related to suburban life, as evidenced in the line, "I've got nothing to say, but it's okay. Good morning, good morning." The end of that song is very peculiar, actually. A series of animal noises can be heard. A bird, a cat, a dog, a horse, and a lion, in that order. The story goes that Lennon requested these animal noises to be heard in that specific order, the order in which they may prey upon each other. 2 songs later, after all of the bombast and good-natured fun of songs like Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, With a Little Help from My Friends, and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which almost certainly is a reference to LSD, despite Lennon's insistence that it wasn't, Sgt. Pepper's closing track, A Day in the Life, orchestrates the tearing down of everything we previously heard on the record, and we're left with the grim realities of life as described in the lyrics, and that haunting, resonant, crashing E-piano chord at the very end of the song. Even more haunting is that last little eerie bit tacked onto the very end of the album, where Lennon and McCartney provide a peculiar message that loops in the run-out groove of the vinyl. Lennon can be heard saying, "Been so high," and McCartney says, "Never could be any other way," over and over again. And then there's Abbey Road. Abbey Road is the band's 11th studio album, and technically their last, as it was kind of recorded inside the making of the Let It Be record, which began before Abbey Road and was completed after. It's likely most notable for the medley of songs that more or less comprise the whole of side 2 on Abbey Road. Tensions continued for most of the recording of Abbey Road, even if the band had good intentions going into the project. McCartney had suggested to producer George Martin that the band record an album in the lighthearted and conflict-free spirit they'd had in the past. Martin agreed, with the caveat that he would be able to produce the record the way he used to in the past, with discipline and without opposition from the band. Harrison later said of the Abbey Road sessions that it felt like we were reaching the end of the line. Lennon wanted all of his songs on one side of the record, and all of McCartney's on the other side. Lennon described the album's medley as junk, and no longer cared for McCartney's contributions. Lennon also didn't play on a number of Abbey Road tracks, and he hated Maxwell's Silver Hammer, a McCartney song that originated from the White Album sessions but was passed on by the rest of the band. By the time Abbey Road was released, Lennon had privately left the Beatles, that information being made public following the departure of McCartney the following year. In my opinion, I think you could certainly make a case for Abbey Road being the best Beatles record. Some people found it to be less than authentic, artificial. but it's typically always in the conversation as being not just one of the greatest Beatles records, but one of the greatest records of all time. It was definitely George Harrison's time to shine, as the two songs he contributed to Abbey Road, Something and Here Comes the Sun, are considered to be two of his best ever. I don't care much for Maxwell's Silver Hammer myself, and its place in the track listing as the third song on the record is kind of surprising, as a McCartney representation. The fourth song, Oh Darling, also a McCartney track, would have made much more sense to me in that third slot. Lennon's I Want You, She's So Heavy is so good, a true demonstration of how far Lennon had come as a songwriter. People called that song a progenitor of heavy metal, as a matter of fact. Ringo wrote Octopus's Garden during the 3 weeks that he had left the Beatles. Apparently he was aboard the yacht of actor Peter Sellers, who told him how an octopus drags rocks and coral around the seabed to form little gardens for themselves. When asked about Mean Mr. Mustard, Lennon would describe it as a bit of crap I wrote while I was in India. And the interpretation of Carry That Weight was the Beatles never being able to distance themselves from their achievements while in the band, forever doomed to live in the shadows of those accomplishments for the rest of their post-Beatle lives. Here's an interesting little fact about the gap between Her Majesty and the rest of the Abbey Road medley. Her Majesty was recorded quickly by McCartney one day as he arrived to the studio before the rest of the group. It was originally included in a rough mix of the medley, appearing between Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam. And you can tell because you can hear that Her Majesty opens with the final crashing chord of Mean Mr. Mustard, while the final note of Her Majesty is buried in the mix of Polythene Pam, as a result of being snipped off the tape reel during that rough mix of the medley. But why does it appear as a hidden track on the album? The reason is McCartney disliked the way the medley sounded when it included Her Majesty. He didn't think that it belonged in there, so he asked for it to be cut out. Now, George Martin had a rule in the studio that all engineers had to abide by: never throw anything out. So after McCartney left the studio, an engineer removed the track, but attached it to the end of the master tape after 20 seconds of silence to separate it from everything else. There was an instruction written on the tape box to leave Her Majesty off the final product, but the next day when mastering engineer Malcolm Davies got the tape, he, also trained by Martin never to throw anything away, decided to create a mastered version of the whole sequence, including Her Majesty, after that 20 seconds of silence. The Beatles liked this idea when it was played back for them, and they decided to use that version on the album. So, which Beatles record is indeed the best? Now, I'm not typically a proponent of determining absolute best songs or albums by artists, just because there are too many variables to consider, and there doesn't need to be a best. But in this case, I would say, since we've come this far, by a slim margin, it's got to be Revolver. It's obvious that the quality is there for all of these recordings, but as one of the most diverse, stylistically vast albums, Revolver was a massive leap into the future, not just for the Beatles, but for popular music itself. Revolver expanded the boundaries of what popular music could be for the first time in the history of recorded music. It completely revolutionized studio recording, and it changed the way that records were made forever. All right, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I did making it. This has been No Sleep Till Sudbury with Brent Jensen. Till next time, folks, take good care.
Brent Jensen is the best-selling author of No Sleep Till Sudbury, Leftover People, and All My Favorite People Are Broken. All titles available in stores and on Amazon worldwide.